coming to get you, Barbara.
Growing up as a horror fan, I'd watch pretty much anything that featured monsters, ghosts, and psycho killers. But one subgenre in particular that always had me captivated was the zombie flick. Undead flesh eaters stalking around streets, halls, and corridors in search of warm bodies to snack on. All while the people that still have a pulse try desperately to escape from the encroaching hordes. There was always something about the single-minded motivation of zombies and their overwhelming numbers that really unnerved me as a kid. More zombies are constantly added to their ranks as our protagonists are backed more and more into a corner they can't escape from. And the idea of the zombie is so simple.
Every dead body that is not exterminated becomes one of them. It gets up and kills. The people it kills get up and kill.
And of all the zombie films I've ever seen, it's really difficult to pick favorites. But two that come to mind are Return of the Living Dead, which introduced a little bit of humor into the mix, and the 1990 remake of the original Night of the Living Dead, which took the basic premise of a group of people trapped in a farmhouse as a growing horde of zombies descends upon them, and updated the visuals, the makeup effects, and made some tweaks to a couple of the characters which I think were definitely for the better, making this, in my opinion, one of the few horror remakes that actually surpasses the original, with Patricia Tallman and Tony Todd in particular delivering some outstanding performances as Barbara and Ben.
God damn you! God damn all of you!
I watched this and other various zombie movies as often as I could when I was a kid, and I'm still hooked on them to this day. So you can imagine what my reaction was when I was 10 years old and heard that there was a new video game from Capcom that itself was like a playable zombie movie, trapping you in a confined space with reanimated corpses hell-bent on having you and your friends for dinner. It was supposedly bloody as hell, absolutely terrifying, and a lot of fun. And that game, of course, was the original Resident Evil from 1996. A groundbreaking game that popularized the genre of survival horror, filled with zombies, monsters, puzzles, and oh so memorable dialogue.
Oh Jill, this house is dangerous. There are terrible demons. Ouch!
I can still remember my first time playing this game. I was sleeping over at my cousin's house, and that weekend they'd rented a PlayStation and a copy of Resident Evil. But we actually weren't allowed to use the TV in the living room where the adults were. So we set up a TV in their dining room, turned off all of the lights, and played this damn game until the PlayStation almost died from overheating. The story was gripping, the action was intense, the creatures were horrifying, the visuals were cutting edge, and it was by far the scariest game I had ever played in my life. But that was almost 30 years ago. And horror games have come a long way since then, with stunning visuals, deeper gameplay, and unprecedented levels of blood and gore. So I wondered to myself, is the original Resident Evil really as good as I remember it being? Or am I still just looking through the rose-tinted glasses of my 10-year-old self? In an effort to answer that question, I replayed the original RE for the first time in a very, very long time, to find out if it's still terrifying, or if it's merely startling. Either way, we're in for some blood, bad voice acting, and more than a few exploding heads. When I was a kid, I found the story told in Resident Evil to be very interesting, even if some of the vocal deliveries were honestly laughable. Though today I appreciate it more for its simplicity than anything else, as once the narrative of the Resident Evil series became more convoluted and the games started to shift their focus to more of an action gameplay style, I lost interest in the series for a long time. Here it's pretty straightforward. A group of characters become trapped in a big, creepy mansion filled with zombies and other horrific creatures, and have to find a way to escape, eventually uncovering that the mansion is attached to a laboratory where the Umbrella Corporation have been conducting experiments with biological weapons, and all of these monsters are a result of their misdeeds. So you round up the survivors, blow up the lab, and make your escape as the story has a satisfying conclusion, That does at least leave the door open for a sequel, since we can assume that this wasn't the only lab that the Umbrella Corporation had in operation. And it had been so long since I played through this game that I actually forgot that there were multiple endings depending on who survives the game, and if you even destroy the lab at all, as I apparently screwed things up pretty bad this time around, leaving Barry for dead and escaping without a final boss battle or destruction of the Spencer Mansion. But luckily, you can always give it another shot. One thing I can concede though, the revelation at the end that the Cerberus zombie dogs, hunters, mutated sharks, and the Tyrant are all meant to be these ultimate biological weapons used for world domination doesn't really make much sense. In a world where we have every kind of weapon you could possibly ever want, up to and including missiles that can wipe out entire populations in a single strike, a big, slow-moving zombie guy with his heart on the outside and a big claw hand doesn't really seem like the best way to fight a war. And judging by all of this high-tech lab equipment and loss of personnel, it's not very cost-effective either, especially considering that all of these bioweapons were taken down by a handful of cops surviving on nothing but herbs and first aid spray. So yeah, it's kinda dumb, but at least it provides us with an excuse to blast some zombies, making the plot of Resident Evil pretty similar to any B-grade horror movie, where despite its simplicity, plot holes, and bad acting, it's still pretty damn entertaining. That's how I felt about it as a kid, and that's how I still feel about it now. And as for the voice work, well, sometimes the shittiest acting is also the most memorable.
Listen, the stars are going to be finished soon. Someone is a traitor.
And you can't piss on hospitality. I won't allow it!
Back in 1996, 3D gaming was still more or less in its infancy, at least for the home console market. Prior to playing Resident Evil, I had dabbled with the likes of Tekken and Battle Arena Toshinden, but hadn't yet tried out any 3D adventure games, making Resident Evil my introduction to the concept itself. And at the time, I was blown away by the visuals, starting with the opening cutscene, which was also my introduction to FMV in video games. I'd known of games that utilized FMV cutscenes on the Sega CD and 3DO, for example, but this was my first time to actually play one, and I was enthralled. Even now, I think the intro is still pretty effective. It's creepy and well shot, and years later, when I finally got to play the Japanese version, I was also able to appreciate the added bit of blood and gore. But before you know it, you're exploring the mansion, and I've gotta say, I still love the look of this place. The pre-rendered backgrounds are extremely detailed, and each room and hallway features a unique design, which helps to make them more memorable, aiding with exploration and backtracking. You can always consult your map when recalling where to go, but it's a lot easier if you can just remember the color of the room and what kind of stuff was inside it. The plant room, the piano room, the tiger statue room, stuff like that. And with the static pre-rendered backgrounds taking up significantly less disk space than fully 3D rendered backgrounds would have, that's just more work that can go into making the character models as detailed as possible. And I'm not gonna say that they still look amazing or anything, but for 1996 they certainly did. Again, with each character and enemy having a very distinct and memorable design. All of the STARS members, for example, even the ones that you only ever see in corpse form, have a unique visual style, and were even given specific jobs and character profiles, or at least in the game manual. They're mostly pretty chewed up when you actually come across them. But the characters that are actually alive, namely Jill, Chris, Barry, Rebecca, and Wesker, utilize a variety of colors in their designs that say something about their character, as well as distinct mannerisms and personalities. Chris, dressed in green, is the clean-cut, gung-ho, tough guy ex-soldier, while Jill in blue is a more by-the-books cop, being the smarter and more resourceful of the two. Barry, in red, shows himself to be a very fatherly and caring figure, especially towards Jill, which pays off later when we learn that Barry's motivations come from his status as a loving father and husband. Rebecca, in white, is the youngest and least experienced of the crew, often needing Chris's help in tight situations, but also being very helpful herself, as well as bringing a bit of sweetness to an otherwise very grim situation.
Yes, sir.
And Wesker, who's shown to be wearing all black and never reveals his eyes, is a very secretive and ultimately treacherous character. These details make each of them very memorable, despite the fact that aside from Jill and Chris, we don't actually spend a ton of time with these characters. On the other hand, the various enemies you'll encounter feature some outstanding designs, some of which legitimately scared me when I was 10 years old. Something I'll never forget was my first encounter with a hunter as it runs into the mansion to attack you, and being horrified at the prospect that these things were now roaming the halls. Of course, the handful of zombie designs are suitably gross looking. The giant snake, and especially the giant spiders, absolutely made my skin crawl because, as we all know,
well, they're the fiercest killers in the insect kingdom.
Plus the dogs, the plant monster, the giant hornets, the sharks, the absolutely hideous chimera, which we actually used to call space monkeys when I was a kid, and of course the big guy himself, Tyrant. Each and every creature had a frightening and memorable design, and despite the limitations of the hardware, the fantastic art direction still really shines through in Resident Evil, whether that be from the characters, creatures, or the environment itself, with plenty of tight spaces and creepy locations to explore, many of which are directly inspired by horror films of the past. And the utilization of strategically placed fixed camera angles gives the whole game a distinctly cinematic vibe, again creating the feeling that I had as a kid that I was playing an interactive horror movie. So while not necessarily impressive anymore from a technical standpoint at least, it's hard to argue that the combination of great art direction, intentional camera work, and clever workarounds for some of the PS1's technical limitations don't make for what I think is still a very visually striking game even 30 years after its release. But of course, when it comes to cultivating horror, the visuals are only half the battle. I'm sure a lot of people can relate to the feeling of tension I felt as a kid when entering a new room or area in Resident Evil, and being aware that something was in there with me just by hearing them. The shuffling and moaning of the zombies, or the sound of footsteps from the dogs or hunters as their claws click against the ground, never failed to put me on edge. And since you couldn't pinpoint where exactly they were, it meant that you just had to find your courage and venture forth, even though you knew that turning the next corner could have you coming face to face with something just waiting to tear your head off. Or you could be a wuss and run out of the room like I'm sure I did on numerous occasions. But the point being, when something as simple as a single sound effect is enough to send you fleeing from a room, that's effective sound design. And that's without even mentioning the excellent music, that again, depending on the track, as soon as it kicked in, you knew you were in for something downright spine-tingling. Whether that be the ominous, bass-heavy tracks that play as you roam halls and explore rooms, the more intense-sounding track that kicks in as you first explore the basement of the mansion, or the track titled More Rooms, which is probably the most unsettling in the game. The soundtrack and sound effects are perfectly complementary and went a long way to making this game feel so damn scary way back in the day. Now, I'm obviously much harder to scare as a grown man, but I still can't deny how the music and sound effects in Resident Evil create a particularly haunting atmosphere that you probably won't ever forget after experiencing it. Of course, you'll also want some good sound effects when firing your weapons, and again, Resident Evil does a fantastic job there. Blasting off zombie heads with the shotgun or the Colt Python is made just that much more satisfying by the loud bang that they produce.
I love that sound.
On the other hand, something that can be pointed out as a negative is, again, the voice acting, which is very stilted, unnatural, and at times just kinda laughable. Almost like the dialogue was written and the actors were directed by people that didn't really speak English all that well. But for someone like me who appreciates when a bad performance is unintentionally hilarious, I honestly wouldn't want the performances in this game to be any other way. When the remake finally rolled around, it featured a much darker visual style and tone, and the voice acting was significantly improved. But if that's the more polished Hollywood version, so to speak, this is the low-budget, trashy New Jersey version. And honestly, I love both. But the line deliveries in the original game never fail to put a smile on my face, and they are infinitely quotable.
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right.
So my appreciation for the sound design in Resident Evil, though not for entirely the same reasons as when I was a kid, hasn't really diminished at all. If you ask me, this game still sounds great. The gameplay in the original Resident Evil is another one of those things that's difficult for me to be objective about, since I have such a high level of nostalgia for this game. Even though I hadn't played it in at least 15 years, I still remembered where most of the items were, and I'm still very comfortable with the tank controls. But I can recall that they took some getting used to when I was a kid. Again, this was my first experience with any kind of free-roaming 3D game, so I really had no frame of reference for how they should play. But eventually, it just made sense. Up always moves forward, down always moves backwards, and you can turn to the left and right. But if you're someone who grew up with the later RE games that use the over-the-shoulder perspective, you might find these controls to be the most horrendous thing ever. Also, due to your limited inventory, any playthrough will require a ton of backtracking, which can get a bit tedious. I have my wits about me now, but that first playthrough all those years ago did get pretty damn confusing. Trying to remember what door required what key and predicting what items I'd potentially need to take with me. Otherwise, be forced to run all the way back to the nearest save room to swap some out. But at the very least, knowing you need a firearm, some ammo, a healing item, and at least one key in your inventory. And you need at least one free space open for those occasions when you come across a puzzle or a locked desk that will reward you with some additional items. And speaking of, there are a handful of puzzles in RE1, but for the most part, they're really easy to figure out. And this is an aspect to the gameplay that would get better in later games. Combat, on the other hand, didn't really change all that much across the PS1 titles, and it's admittedly kinda clunky, especially in vanilla RE1, which lacks the auto-aim function, so missing shots is a fairly common occurrence with certain enemies, namely the ones that are highly mobile, like the dogs and the hunters. And when you're dealing with such a limited ammo supply, getting all of your shots on target can mean the difference between life and death.
Nice shot! Nice shot! Nice shot! Nice shot! Nice shot! Nice shot! Nice shot!
Also, I'll mention now that I did record this footage on the DuckStation PS1 emulator, and I admittedly cheated by using save states before heading into boss encounters. But otherwise, you'll need to use ink ribbons to save your progress, and these two are in short supply, giving you a limited number of saves. And this is another thing that could be supremely frustrating, either dying in a boss fight or just getting caught without any healing items, and then comes the painful realization that it would have been a good idea to save at some point. But again, if you're playing on emulation, that's not something you really need to worry about anymore. Something I did for this playthrough though that I pretty much never did as a kid was finish the game with both Jill and Chris. You get a much easier time when playing as Jill, so that's what I always did, being a bit too intimidated to play as Chris and leaving that to my older cousins, as playing as Chris is essentially playing RE1 on hard mode, which in fairness does make for a more tense and exciting playthrough, giving you a smaller inventory to work with plus fewer ammo and health pickups. But playing it now, I realize that a big part of what makes Chris's scenario so much more difficult is that Chris is kind of incompetent, I guess you could say. For example, Jill is the master of unlocking, so she can pick locks of certain doors as well as all of the desks in the game, whereas Chris will need to amass a collection of small keys to accomplish this same task. Or the fact that Jill can play the piano saves her some time, while Chris, on the other hand, is completely musically illiterate and needs Rebecca to play the piano for him. And likewise, Jill has the expertise in chemistry to mix together the V-jolt needed to take down Plant 42. But Chris apparently failed chemistry and isn't even competent enough to handle the chemicals, once again relying on Rebecca to get him out of a tight spot.
You'd do the same for me, wouldn't you?
Yeah?
I guarantee it.
Plus, when playing as Jill, you get a ton of assistance from Barry, perhaps the most helpful NPC of all time. But the end result is that Jill is much better for beginners, or if you want a less stressful playthrough, and Chris is better suited for people who want a bit more of a challenge. But overall, I still really enjoyed playing RE1 again, even if I can admit that it does have its flaws in terms of the controls and the excessive amounts of backtracking that's required of you. And the fact that there are multiple endings depending on how well you play, and even some bonuses for playing especially well, does encourage multiple playthroughs. And as you become more familiar with the mansion, you can start burning through RE1 in pretty short order, popping heads all along the way. So while it's not exactly a frightening experience anymore, it is still a hell of a lot of fun.
I just used him for my personal purposes, though both you and Barry seem to think I was following orders from Umbrella.
So you're planning something else?
Yeah?
So to sum up, the experience of playing Resident Evil now is obviously very different from what it was when I was 10 years old. It's not scary anymore, but still impresses me with the quality of its visuals and the atmosphere that's induced by the sound design. And it's still a fun game overall. It's definitely less frustrating when you already know where pretty much everything is located and you can save anytime you want. But the experience of exploring the mansion and blasting zombies will, at least for me, never get old. There were a couple of updates also released on the PS1, as well as about 1 million sequels and a remake that still holds up as one of the best remakes in video game history. But there's a certain charm that the original Resident Evil has that's never quite been recaptured in the rest of the series. A lack of polish that makes it endearing, especially for someone who had the pleasure of experiencing it when it was still fresh. Or rotten, I guess would be a better word to use. Regardless, I'll always love this game, and even if you don't, you have to admit that it started a survival horror dynasty that's still going strong to this day, scaring and entertaining millions of gamers all over the world. And for that, Resident Evil deserves all the praise that I can heap upon it. In short, this game was, is, and always will be awesome.
You're right.
Awesome!